Begin the library story hop at the Library Company of Philadelphia, founded in 1731 through an agreement signed by Benjamin Franklin and other subscribers. The founders were not building a free public library in the modern sense. They were creating a cooperative collection at a time when books were expensive, imported, and difficult for ordinary readers to obtain. Members pooled money, ordered volumes, and built an institution that made knowledge available through shared ownership. The address on Locust Street is a later home, but the idea began in the print culture of colonial Philadelphia. This stop also asks us to confront who was allowed to read. The route's clue points to Othello, an enslaved boy connected to the Library Company in 1739. Treat that story with care. A reading privilege is not the same thing as freedom, membership, or equal access. It shows an enslaved person's intellectual life appearing inside an institution created by people who lived within a society that permitted slavery. That contradiction is historically important. Libraries can preserve evidence of human possibility and human inequality at the same time. As you stand here, imagine the practical work behind early reading, ordering a book across the Atlantic, recording it in a catalog, circulating it among shareholders, and deciding whose requests would be recognized. Then look at the building as a modern archive. Its value is not only the books on shelves, but the evidence that lets researchers ask better questions about power, literacy, race, labor, and citizenship. Your clue is to connect the founding date, the shared subscription model, and Othello's reading privilege. The story hop begins by teaching that a library is never neutral storage. It is a set of decisions about whose words survive and who gets to encounter them. At the Athenaeum of Philadelphia, the story shifts from a colonial subscription library to an institution founded in 1814 to support serious reading, research, and public culture. The Athenaeum was created decades before the rise of the free public library, and its members built a collection that connected Philadelphia readers with literature, history, architecture, science, and the arts. The present building on Washington Square was designed by John Knopman and opened in 1847. Its brownstone Italianate exterior is intentionally restrained compared with the monumental civic buildings nearby. That restraint is part of the lesson: libraries often make power look quiet. Your clue is Edgar Allan Poe. Poe lived and worked in Philadelphia during the 1830s and 1840s, and the Athenaeum preserves a physical trace associated with his visit, initials connected with 1843. Do not treat the mark as a theatrical autograph or assume that every scratched letter proves a complete story. Instead, ask what makes a small physical trace valuable to an archive. It is valuable because the institution records its location, compares it with other evidence, and places it inside a documented history of the building and the visitor. Poe's presence also opens a wider Philadelphia story. He was writing, reviewing, editing, and trying to earn a living in a city with active magazines, publishers, lecture halls, libraries, and reading audiences. The literary city was not an abstract network, it was made of rooms, sidewalks, hotels, offices, and institutions like this one. As your clue, note the date 1843, the Washington Square setting, and the difference between a library's official records and a writer's informal mark. This stop asks you to value both kinds of evidence. The catalogue tells us what an institution chose to preserve. The initials remind us that readers and writers also leave accidental traces. You are at Parkway Central Library, the largest and most visibly public stop on this route. Opened in 1927, the building represents a different library ideal from the Library Company and the Athenaeum, a city-funded institution intended to serve a broad public, with reading rooms, children's services, circulating materials, and research collections under one roof. The building's location on the Benjamin Franklin Parkway places it among museums, public monuments, and cultural institutions. But the real story is inside the collections. The clue here is Charles Dickens and his raven, Grip. The Free Library's rare book department holds a major Dickens collection with first editions, letters, artwork, and personal objects. It also preserves Grip, The pet raven associated with the character in Dickens's novel Barnaby Rudge and widely understood as an inspiration for Edgar Allan Poe's poem The Raven. The Free Library notes that Poe reviewed Barnaby Rudge for Graham's magazine, noticed the raven character, and then developed his own literary use of the bird. This is a chain of influence rather than a single moment of copying. A real animal became a household story, a novelist turned it into a character, another writer transformed the character into a symbol of grief and mortality, and an archive preserved the physical evidence of the connection. Look at the building's entrance and imagine the movement from public reading room to rare book vault. The same institution can welcome a child looking for a story, a student researching a thesis, and a scholar examining an author's manuscript. Your clue is to connect Dickens, Grip, Poe, and the library's role as keeper of objects that let literature become tangible. The point is not that a stuffed raven explains an entire poem. The point is that literary history grows through encounters, collections, and surviving evidence. At the Rosenbach Museum and Library, the route enters a townhouse where rare books, manuscripts, artwork, furniture, and the history of collecting come together. The Rosenbach brothers were important Philadelphia book dealers and collectors, and the museum's 1860s houses preserve the intimate scale of a private library rather than the broad civic scale of Parkway Central. That difference changes how we think about access. A public library is designed for movement and volume. A rare book museum asks visitors to slow down, protect the objects, and understand why a particular edition, manuscript, or drawing matters. The Roots clue combines Maurice Sendak with a history of children's literature, including the original Winnie the Pooh toys associated with the museum's exhibitions and collecting history. Sendak became a trustee of the Rosenbach in 1973 and later served as honorary president. The Rosenbach explains that he deposited more than 10,000 pieces of original artwork, manuscripts, dummy books, proofs, and correspondence there for decades, making the museum a major center for the study of his working process. The institution also became associated with children's literature through the Rosenbach's collecting interests and the way original objects can reveal the material life behind familiar stories. When you think about Winnie the Pooh, do not stop at nostalgia. Ask what a toy, sketch, manuscript, or first edition can show that a finished book cannot. It can reveal sequence, revision, ownership, wear, scale, and the relationship between a child's playroom and a published cultural world. Maurice Sendak understood that children's books can hold fear, humor, grief, and complexity without talking down to young readers. This stop asks you to connect that artistic seriousness with the museum's preservation work. Note the Delancey Place townhouse, the role of the collector, Sendak's long relationship with the Rosenbach, and the difference between an original object and a reproduction. The story hop is now about how imaginative worlds survive materially. At the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, the story hop turns to documents that record argument, revision, and the making of government. The Society's collections include constitutional papers connected with the Philadelphia Convention of 1787. One important item is James Wilson's manuscript report, described by the Society as the earliest surviving version of the Constitution. Other drafts and printed versions preserve marginal notes and changes by delegates. The Roots clue refers to an early constitutional draft and an edit associated with Thomas Jefferson. Be precise here, Jefferson did not attend the 1787 Constitutional Convention, so his relationship to a constitutional manuscript must be described through the evidence attached to the particular document, not through a claim that he sat in the convention room. Archival history depends on that kind of precision. A draft is not the final constitution. It is a working document, and its value lies partly in the visible process of revision. Words are added, removed, moved, qualified, and sometimes left behind in the margins. Those marks let us see that political language was made by people negotiating with one another rather than delivered fully formed. This is also a useful place to ask who appears in the document and who does not. The Constitution created a framework for government while leaving slavery, citizenship, gender, and indigenous sovereignty unresolved or contested. A library or historical society does not erase those contradictions by preserving the papers. It gives researchers the material needed to study them. Look at the society's role as a steward. It protects fragile paper, provides finding aids, builds exhibitions, and helps the public encounter documents that otherwise would be locked away in private collections. Your clue is to identify the draft, the edit, and the difference between an original manuscript, a later copy, and a printed official version. The larger lesson is that democracy has an archive. If we want to understand how power was made, we must read not only the final text, but the revisions that came before it. At Temple University's Charles L. Blockson Afro-American Collection, the route reaches a library built around the principle that Black history must be collected, interpreted, and made available on its own terms. Charles L. Blockson began collecting as a child after a teacher told him that Black people had no history. He spent his life answering that lie with books, photographs, newspapers, manuscripts, sheet music, posters, oral histories, and material culture. Temple describes the collection as one of the nation's leading research facilities for the history and culture of people of African descent, with holdings ranging from the 16th century to the present. The stop's clue is Harriet Tubman's personal hymn book, a small object with an enormous human range. A hymn book can carry theology, memory, travel, community, and emotional survival. It can tell us that freedom work was not only strategy and danger, it was also song, belief, discipline, and the ability to carry a portable inner life. Temple reports that Blockson inherited personal items from Tubman's great-niece and later donated Tubman's signed hymnal and other objects to the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. That detail helps us distinguish between a collection's local role and an object's current custody. The Blockson collection remains essential because it preserves the networks, publications, and research context that allow individual artifacts to be understood rather than isolated. Look around Sullivan Hall and imagine the difference between a famous name and a research collection. A name can inspire a quick story. A collection gives scholars thousands of points of connection: abolition, migration, religion, education, labor, performance, family history, and Philadelphia's Black communities. Your clue is to link Blockson's collecting mission, Tubman's hymn book, and the idea that archives can repair a public record that earlier institutions neglected. This is not only a stop about what survived. It is about who decided that survival mattered. Return to Parkway Central's Children's Department for the final stop, where the library's public mission becomes visible at a child's height. The department is not an ornamental corner added to a serious institution. It is a declaration that children are readers, researchers, listeners, and future custodians of culture. The Free Library's own visitor materials point to children's collections, vintage Children's Book Week posters, original artwork, and special exhibitions that connect young readers with the history of illustration and publishing. The route's clue refers to original Winnie the Pooh toys displayed in connection with the story of children's literature and the material world behind books. Whether you encounter the toys in a current exhibition or learn about them through the library's collections, the important question is how an object travels from private play to public memory. A toy can be handled, carried, misplaced, repaired, and loved. A book can transform that private experience into a story shared by generations. A library then preserves both the story and the evidence of how people received it. This final stop also brings the route back to the beginning. At the library company, we asked who was allowed to read. At the Athenaeum, we followed a writer's trace. At Parkway Central, we met Dickens and Grip, then moved through the Rosenbach's Rare Objects, HSP's Constitutional Drafts, and the Blockson Collection's work of restoring Black historical visibility. Here, the audience is not an abstract future. It is the child standing at a shelf, following a picture, asking a question, or discovering that a city contains more stories than one textbook can hold. Finish by naming the route's 7 forms of evidence: subscription records, carved initials, a preserved animal, children's toys, constitutional drafts, a hymn book, and the library building itself. Together they show that history lives in institutions and objects, but also in the readers who keep asking what those objects mean.